Welcome to Burr Forman's 2023 Day of Remembrance program. Day of Remembrance is a recurring effort of the firm's social justice initiative. In the past, we have observed Days of Remembrance by visiting museums and historic sites, but this year we decided to visit history through the written word. One of the core goals of SJI is to remember history, learn the patterns of injustice so that we recognize them and do everything we can to not repeat them. This goal seems ever more important as society worldwide continues to divide itself off into various factions and repeat cycles of violence. This very real threat of violence against the so-called other, whether based on race, religion, nationality, or any other human illusion of difference, is why I think the book Built from the Fire is so important. The book humanizes the suffering and loss of this particular community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, highlighting their individual dreams as well as their collective efforts and accomplishments, putting names and dates and family lineage on the face of this ethnic conflict really helps to anchor the deep cost of injustice. I want to thank Birmingham associate Emily Penley for passing on her client's recommendation of this book. The client was a friend of the book's author, Victor Luckerson. We are grateful that Victor has agreed to speak with us today. Victor moved to Tulsa to conduct research for this book. It is his labor of love and will no doubt serve as a resource for history lovers for generations to come. For today, Victor has prepared a presentation that will focus on the legal battles faced by entrepreneurs who lost their businesses and properties in the Tulsa Race Massacre. After his presentation, we will open up the floor for Q&A as time allows. Thank you. Victor, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tamika, for that great introduction. And thank all y'all for being here on the call with us and also for taking the time to dig into this book over the last couple of months. It was very exciting for me when I went to the local bookstore in Tulsa and signed 60 copies of my book at one time. We took a photo of it. It went a little mini viral in Tulsa, actually, me with all those books. So I'm just so excited to be with some of the folks who are diving into the story. This is actually my first time talking to a group of lawyers, so I'm getting to channel my mock trial energy from high school. As Tamika said, I'm planning to actually walk through a little bit of some of the legal issues that were going on, not only right after the race massacre, but that have been playing out in more recent years. There's an ongoing reparations lawsuit y'all might be familiar with. Today, I'm actually going to dive in particular into the story of Lula Williams. For any of y'all who've dived into the book, you know that Lula owned the Dreamland Theater. She was a very autonomous woman, one of my favorite figures to learn about, but she also faced a lot of really horrible, challenging legal issues after the massacre that ended up playing into her own physical and psychological issues as well. And so I'm going to kind of walk into a little bit more depth on Lula's story over the next 20 to 25 minutes. So I first came to know Lula through this image, actually. If y'all have sort of maybe even Googled Black Wall Street before or just seen documentaries about Black Wall Street, you might have seen this photo. This is Lula sitting in the passenger seat, her husband, John, here in the driver's seat with the hat on, and the little boy in the back is W.D. Williams, their son. And so this was really become, in some ways, like the iconic Black Wall Street image. They're driving a Norwalk car, which is kind of like a much nicer version of a Model T from back in the day. So this photo kind of shows the level of opulence that was available to some folks in Greenwood. And so for me, it was interesting to come across this photo. I mean, I saw this photo before I even started on the book. And I made some assumptions, I think, based on this image. You know, I saw John in the driver's seat, Lula in the passenger seat. And then for me, at least, it made me kind of assume some things about the dynamics of the relationship and maybe some traditional hierarchies, you know. Maybe John is the one kind of in charge of the business in this family and Lula is in charge of homemaking or that kind of thing. I would come to find out that wasn't true at all, and that Lula was very much her own woman. To give a little background about Lula that goes beyond what's in the book, she was born in 1879 in Jackson, Tennessee. She actually attended Lane College, which is an HBCU in Jackson. And she and her husband, John, moved to Tulsa around 1907, which is it's the same year that Oklahoma became a state, and only 2 years after O.W. Gurley built the first business in Greenwood. They were really one of the very, very first business families to be in the neighborhood. The first thing I found that sort of showed me that Lula was doing more than being in the passenger seat was the fact that she actually bought the Williams building in 1909 in her own name, and even her maiden name of Lula Cotton. I've actually been kind of digging into this a little bit more with some other academics, because when I actually analyzed a lot of land records in Greenwood, I found that in many cases, women were the ones on the property records rather than their husbands. Now, if you learn about the Black Wall Street sort of mythology, you'll hear names like J.B. Stratford, A.J. Smitherman, and John Williams, her husband. You don't hear as much about the women. And actually, talking to some other academics, I discovered that in the West, sort of not only in Oklahoma, but elsewhere, it was actually much more common for women to be the ones on the property records, like leading the businesses. That was a much more common dynamic in the West compared to in the Deep South, where a lot of these folks were coming from. And so Lula's case is actually not that unique if you actually look at a lot of other Greenwood entrepreneurs. And so she actually opened a confectionery in 1909 in this building right on Greenwood Avenue that offered candy, ice cream, soda fountain. Her son WD said that it was the only place on the block that had anything besides bootleg whiskey. So I love that quote, and that's a little nugget from the book itself. And here's actually the property deed itself from Lula. A lot of my research involved going to the Tulsa County Courthouse and diving into physical records. And so that was really, in a lot of ways, how I was able to sort of shape the architecture and landscape of Greenwood in the book. So after Lula opened the confectionery in 1909, she and her husband together opened the Dreamland in 1914. Their names are together on the property record for this property. And the thing that kind of happened when this place opened, it was immediately a big hit in Greenwood. There are accounts from folks who remember going to see, lining up for movies every Friday night at the Dreamland. It got a lot of press, both in the Black press at Tulsa Star, but also in the white press in Tulsa, which just shows what a prominent business it was. However, when it was open, John got all the credit. So I remember finding this article in the Tulsa World that called John the Negro Rockefeller, and Lula was not mentioned at all, even though she had owned the confectionery in her own name by herself, and clearly was very instrumental in the creation of the Dreamland. In 1915, John actually sold his stake to Lula, so she became the sole owner of the property in 1915. And then in 1919, this is one of my favorite finds in the entire years of my research. Lula filed this affidavit in the Tulsa County Courthouse that said, and it's here right here on the screen, but it said that, you know, I, Lula Williams, own everything in the Dreamland. I own the picture machine. I own the projector, popcorn machine, the seats. I own all of it. John has no right herein or unto. And so finding that document for me actually really helped me to characterize Lula as an independent woman and someone who's really defending her own entrepreneurship, success, and autonomy in an era when that was much less common for women to be doing. And so this is another great find in the research. The Topeka Plain Dealer, which is a Black newspaper in Kansas, I wrote a profile of Lula in 1919, and they called her a theatrical magnate and the amusement queen. And so this is just a great sort of, you know, transition, I think, or evolution from being ignored while the Tulsa World called her husband the Negro Rockefeller to being labeled the amusement queen in 1919. And so I don't have any documentation of this, but I'm very confident that Lula herself was probably advocating to get this kind of coverage for herself when you think about the way she was moving in this era. And so it was really exciting to find this particular newspaper article. Her family had actually never seen it, so I was able to share this with her family during my research. And one of her great-grandsons actually put it on a T-shirt, this photo of Lula and the family. And so as I was doing all of my research, I really tried to, whenever I found things, to share them with the families that were involved. We're not going to get into this today in much of my talk today, but Lula's story and the Dreamland story is actually the basis of the Watchmen TV show. If anybody saw that, that family that sort of survives Tulsa in that story is loosely based on Watchmen. I mean, loosely based on the Williams family. But the Williams family was never consulted or involved at all in the creation of that show. They didn't even know that the Dreamland was going to be in it until it was on TV on HBO. And so when I met the family, I tried to make sure I was moving in a more intentional way than that. And so they were involved at every step in terms of helping me with my research. I shared everything about their family with them before the book was published. And so it was really important for me for this process to not feel extractive and instead to feel additive to their own legacy. So Lula's, you know, she's built the Dreamland, she's built the confectionery, she's the amusement queen. But unfortunately, on May 31st, 1921, a white mob invaded Greenwood on the false presumption of a rape allegation, attempted rape allegation against a white girl named Sarah Page. I do always like to point out for people that sort of if you think about the chronology of events of what happened, this black shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland gets falsely accused of attempted rape. He gets arrested by the Tulsa police. He's being held in the Tulsa County Jail. And it's really important to understand too that after that happened, this group of black soldiers or black veterans came to the county jail to kind of defend Dick Rowland. And it was really that, I think, that show of black self-defense and black defiance is actually kind of what escalated things. White Tulsa wasn't going to countenance the idea of black people arming themselves and defending one of their own. And so that is really sort of the actual impetus for this sort of unprecedented level of violence. And so during the night of May 31st and the morning of June 1st, a mob of as many as 5,000 white Tulsans invaded the Greenwood district. The destruction lasted for between 12 and 16 hours. They destroyed 1,256 homes, hundreds of businesses. And the book itself actually followed the Williams family in particular through these hours. W.D. Williams, Lula's son, has given several very vivid firsthand accounts of what happened. And so in the book, you kind of see through his eyes what it was like to be in Greenwood on the morning of June 1st and see these armed men approaching with guns, how he had to escape his apartment as windows were being shot out, how he ultimately was put in an internment camp in Greenwood on that same day and was not even able to be let out until a white employee of the Dreamland came and vouched for him. So just think about that. This guy's from this really prominent family that's accomplished so much in Tulsa, but after this vicious attack, he cannot get out until a white man says that, he's okay. He's a safe Negro, essentially. And so the family itself lost the Dreamland Theater, the Williams Confectionery, the Williams Building, which also included where they lived in their apartment, as well as other offices for lawyers and doctors in Greenwood, and also John Williams owned an auto garage, which was also destroyed. So they lost all of this property. And a really vivid memory for me, or anecdote for me, was from WD's accounts that, so WD and his mother got separated right after the race massacre. They were separated for about a day or two, and they kind of ran into each other on the street almost by chance in downtown Tulsa. And it's really dramatic. They're running across the street to each other, hugging, kissing, embracing. And Lula's very first move after she found her son was to go to the attorney's office. So like right after this happened, she knew she needed to be seeking restitution. So for Lula, like so many other people, the destruction of Greenwood created an immediate and urgent financial burden. Much of the land in Greenwood was actually, much of it was black owned, as a lot of people know, but it's probably less understood that it was actually heavily mortgaged. And so when I was going through these property records, I found out that people like Lula Williams, J.B. Stratford, the hotel owner, they were very overextended financially. They were taking out really, really large loans against their property to keep building up their businesses. And so when everything gets destroyed, it really puts them in a huge bind because they're not going to be able to generate any more revenue, from their businesses. The massacre actually predates traditional long-term home mortgages. That was an outcome of the Great Depression. And so in this era, instead of having a 25-year mortgage on your home, you would kind of keep remortgaging it every 2 or 3 years, basically. And so the Williams Building had about $5,000 in outstanding loans at the time of the massacre. Stratford Hotel by J.B. Stratford, like I mentioned, was $20,000. And so when this destruction happens, it really puts these folks in a huge amount of debt very, very suddenly and having no real way to sort of climb out of the debt without being able to have their business in operation. For a lot of folks who wanted to rebuild, obviously that was going to require loan money, but often if there were loans issued, they were predatory in nature. The interest rate could be 20% or more, whereas a fair interest rate at that area would have been probably about 6 to 8%. So Lula's home, her dreamland is destroyed. She has this enormous debt from her mortgages. There's no way to make money right now. So ideally, what she would have had as an opportunity would have been her insurance policies. Lula, before the massacre, bought 8 policies from 3 insurance firms, and she was paying a total of $860 in premiums. And if those policies had been paid out, she would have gotten $32,000, which would have been a really big help in terms of all of the challenges she was suddenly facing. I was able to get access to a lot of the lawsuits that Lula and others filed after the race massacre. And so they include actually itemized lists of everything that she owned. So here's an itemized list of all the items at the Dreamland. You can see the ticket machine, one desk, the plate glass booth, etc. And so she and many other massacre survivors actually filed these sort of suits that had a really detailed list of all that they lost. And so for me as a writer, that was helpful for earlier in the book, because I could actually describe in more detail what was in the Dreamland and places like that. And obviously, more importantly, it's a ledger of all the things that, they claimed that were never honored by insurance companies, the city of Tulsa, any private or governmental entities. So Lula files these insurance claims, but the companies won't pay. Why won't they pay? The issue is actually that in all of these insurance policies, there was a riot exclusion clause. And so in any typical policy of the day, if you get a fire insurance policy, they're going to say that they're not going to pay out if there's a riot. The specific language in Lula's policy was, this company should not be liable for a loss caused directly or indirectly by invasion, insurrection, riot, civil war, or commotion. She was trying to get money from a Kansas-based company called the Central States Fire Insurance Company. And because they would not pay her, Lula ultimately filed a lawsuit. There were actually several dozen lawsuits filed against insurance companies. And when you combine suits against both the insurance companies and the city of Tulsa, there are more than 200 lawsuits filed by race massacre survivors in the immediate aftermath. So I was actually able to dive deep into the actual lawsuit itself, read both Lula's argument and the insurance company's counter argument. And so when you read what the insurance companies are saying about why they shouldn't have to pay, they're really hinging their argument on the fact that there was a riot that happened in Greenwood. And here that in Central State's argument, they said that the defendant further alleges that there was a race riot between the white and colored races upon the premises where the property described said policy was then located. And for me, this part was really important. They said hundreds of persons of both races were armed with firearms and other weapons and supplied with matches and other materials for setting fire to and burning property. If we go back and look at the actual play-by-play of what happened in Greenwood, there were no white properties destroyed. All the property that was burned with matches was in Greenwood itself. And so the notion that it was sort of like even-handed battle between whites and blacks, that's just not true of how things actually played out, especially when you consider what happened in terms of destruction of property. In fact, the Tulsa Police Department and the National Guard, in a lot of ways, they ended up using all their energy to like protect white property. And so they were spending a lot of time as this mob was building up on the night of May 31st, trying to protect white-owned property. They had this sort of failed vision of a black insurrection that was going to happen. So they even wasted time, imagined that these black guys from Muskogee were going to come in and start shooting at white folks, but there actually weren't anybody coming in. It was just false rumor. And so a lot of time and energy actually wasted in the effort to protect white property. Meanwhile, black property gets destroyed. But later, when it's all sort of being narrativized, we're hearing about this idea that actually was an even-handed battle, and maybe people on both sides were facing losses, which wasn't true. This language is actually pretty boilerplate, I found, and it was actually used in dozens of lawsuits across different companies. And more than 30 insurance companies were sued by agreement property owners in total. And in fact, some of them still exist today. I know at least that the Hartford does and Great American, and it would not surprise me if others do, but were kind of rolled up into other firms over time. So in terms of how we understand how these lawsuits were argued, Lula's case and the vast majority were never heard in court. However, there was one white business owner in Greenwood named William Redfern. If y'all read the book, you might remember that there was a competing theater called the Dixie Theater across from Lula's, owned by a white man. And so this white man, William Redfern, he actually did get his day in court, unlike the black property owners. So his case was against the American Central Insurance Company, and it's actually a pretty big sort of like anchor case in understanding the race massacre because a lot of massacre survivors testified in the case. And so I've actually looked through the I've looked through the lawsuit, I've looked through the lawsuit transcripts. And so you'll see people like O.W. Gurley, Barney Cleaver, who was a black Tulsa police officer, and even an employee of the Dreamland Theater, Henry Souders, all testified as to what happened on the night of May 31st and June 1st. So it's actually a really valuable historical document, this lawsuit. And this book over here, if anyone's interested in learning more about the legal dynamics of the race massacre, I highly recommend this book called Reconstructing the Dreamland. It's by a former University of Oklahoma professor named Alfred Brophy, and it goes into more detail than any other text about the actual legal battles surrounding the race massacre. So great book right there. So in Redfern's argument, the idea was that this riot exclusion clause isn't valid in this case. Like what happened wasn't a riot, it was something else. Therefore, the insurance company should pay. And the precedent that his attorneys used was this case called American Central Insurance Company versus Stearns Lumber. There was an incident happening in Kentucky earlier in the decade in which there were rioters in a building owned by Stearns Lumber, and the police decided they wanted to basically burn the people out of the building. So to force the rioters out of the building owned by Stearns Lumber, a police marshal set fire to the building. And the idea being that if the Kentucky Court of Appeals found that the marshal's actions voided the riot exclusion clause because he set fire to the building without authority. This is really important because in the case of Tulsa, there were a lot of people that were deputized by police who were involved in the destruction. And according to eyewitness accounts, there were actually police officers themselves who were involved in burning Greenwood and attacking Black folks. So if this case is sort of held up as valid, it means that if the state is involved in the destruction of a community, then this riot exclusion clause is no longer valid. Because we're saying that the case could be read as saying damage was caused by state actors, which again would void that clause. From this decision, it was said that Marshall's posse acting under his orders were not rioters. And so Redfern thought he would be able to use this argument to bolster his own case in Oklahoma. So this was a Kentucky case that the Oklahoma attorney cited, hoping that it would bolster the case that the insurance companies had to pay, more or less. So Redfern's case goes all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and ultimately the decision comes out against him. In the actual decision, the judge said that a number of witnesses testified that these groups of white men, many of them wearing police badges, went inside the buildings, and after they left, fires broke out inside the buildings. So here we're essentially acknowledging the fact that these folks with some kind of police authority did burn Greenwood. So the judge is at least acknowledging that part of it. However, the court determined that the men wearing the police badges were not attempting to make arrests when they set the fires. So the fires were not part of police duties. So it really became this really, in my opinion, kind of like bizarrely fine distinction between what these folks were doing. You know, these men who were acknowledging were at least had some level of police authority because they were not doing their police duties at the time of the destruction of Greenwood. We're not going to say that they were state actors at the time of the destruction. The court also questioned actually whether the men with the badge were actually officers. However, you have to look at the documentation. You'll find that there were men who were actually found in a state investigation who were police officers to be involved in the destruction. So ultimately, Redfern lost his case because of this distinction between when a person is a rioter versus a cop, basically. And no other cases were ever heard. No cases by Black property owners were ever heard in Tulsa. So Lula ultimately received her premium back from her insurance company, but she did not get that $32,000 that actually be covered by the policy. So at the same time that there were suits going on against the city of Tulsa, against the insurance companies, there were also some going on against the city of Tulsa. In May 1923, dozens of lawsuits were filed by massacre victims against the city. Lula and her husband filed one of them. And these attorneys, Elisha Scott, H.A. Guest, and George W. Carey, are all actually Black attorneys. H.A. Guest is actually from Tulsa. So they were Black attorneys from the region who kind of banded together to file a lot of lawsuits. B.C. Franklin is also mentioned in the book a lot. He was a very prominent Greenwood attorney. He also filed several of these lawsuits himself. And so against the city of Tulsa, the argument was that the city of Tulsa, through its lawfully organized police forces, conspired, acquiesced, and assisted in the wrongful endeavors of burning, pillaging, and destroying Greenwood. And so these lawsuits alleged direct city involvement through the police in the action of the race massacre. But ultimately, none of these cases ever went to trial, and dozens of them were dismissed on the very same day in 1937. So for Lula, she was going through all these legal battles right after the race massacre. She never got any significant money except her small premiums she had paid directly to the insurance companies. And, you know, her saga afterwards, for me, was really quite heartbreaking. She did manage to actually rebuild the Dreamland right after the Race Massacre, thanks to a loan from a Black fraternal society. However, the family had owned 2 other theaters outside of Tulsa, both of which were forced to close because they didn't have the money to keep them up. They ultimately fell behind on their mortgage payments in Tulsa. They had to enter this kind of like predatory agreement with this entrepreneur who's kind of buying up distressed theaters around Oklahoma. Ultimately, he didn't sort of hold up his end of the bargain for paying back their debts. They ultimately sue this guy. They lose that case. And at the end of the day, they actually lost control of the Dreamland itself too. And so all that's playing out between, let's say, like 1921 and 1926 or so, all of these really difficult, grinding legal battles. At the very same time, Lulu was actually going into a really steep physical and mental decline. According to her brother-in-law, who was a doctor, her symptoms sort of started showing up in about September of 1921. She's having a harder time remembering things, harder time getting up the stairs, a lot of issues like that. Even though as late as 1924, she was writing letters to her Dreamland customers about how great their comeback was going to be. She actually got admitted to a sanitarium that very same year. Her decline accelerated, and ultimately she died in 1927. I was really fortunate in my research to get some letters she had written to her son WD from her family. And so in those letters, you can actually see Lula not talking about her mental issues, but talking about the challenges of the business, right? She's talking about how a lot of her employers are leaving because you can't pay them anymore. She's talking about how instead of being able to plan a strategy for the Dreamland, she has to take tickets in the cold out front. And actually, I noticed as I was reading these letters that her penmanship is getting worse over time. And so you can really kind of observe the physical and mental ramifications of, I think, a lot of these legal issues she's having to deal with. I think in a world where Lula was made whole quickly, she would have been able to sort of combat these issues in a much more direct way. And when she died in 1927, her death was attributed to the Race Massacre by the Black press in Tulsa. So Lula passes away in 1927, but the story certainly does not end with her. Her family has been one among many who continue to fight for justice in the decades since the Race Massacre. In 2003, Lula's granddaughter, Anita Christopher, was a plaintiff on a class action lawsuit against the state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa. B.C. Franklin, who I mentioned before, his son, John Hope Franklin, was also part of this case, actually. And if y'all read the book, the Goodwin family is featured very prominently. And Jim Goodwin was actually an attorney on this case, too, along with Charles Ogletree, who's a very prominent civil rights attorney, and Johnny Cochran. However, in this case, the federal courts ruled that the statute of limitations had expired, and so the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. This one is really tough for me at least, to countenance, because in the sort of legal arguments in this 2000s case, the fact that the Lula and others had filed lawsuits in the 1920s was kind of held against the current case, because the idea was that, well, you had your day in court and you lost then, so we can't let you kind of run the same argument again. And I think that's a big shame, because I know from my research that there were members of the Ku Klux Klan who were judges in Oklahoma at the time. There was even a member of the Klan who was a city attorney who was waging legal defense against Lula and others. And so, for me at least, I'm no attorney, but it doesn't hold up to scrutiny the idea that we're going to hold all these cases that were filed in an era when America was barely a functioning democracy even as legal precedent in modern times. But that's where our system works today. And therefore, this case ultimately was declined to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. So after that case, the issue, at least in terms of the courts, was pretty fallow for a long time. However, in 2020, massacre survivors and descendants filed a public nuisance case against the city of Tulsa and others. They were seeking redress for urban renewal and other issues, such as leveraging the massacre for tourism dollars. So this case was actually a pretty interesting and novel use of public nuisance law. That's a fairly obscure law in Oklahoma that's kind of been dusted off in recent times. The way this case kind of came about was mainly because there was actually an opioids case in Oklahoma against Johnson & Johnson, arguing that their marketing of opioids had actually created a public nuisance in Oklahoma. And so in that case, they were actually found guilty in the lawsuit, and they were being forced to make a payout for creating a public nuisance through their actions. And so basically, if you can prove that either a government entity or organization has created a public nuisance and the nuisance is ongoing, then a court can just prescribe some sort of abatement to get rid of the nuisance. And so that was the argument here, was that the city of Tulsa, the National Guard, and other government organizations had created a public nuisance in 1921. The nuisance continue through issues like redlining, urban renewal, etc., and therefore a court should decree an abatement of the nuisance. That's been the core argument of this case. However, I mentioned the fact that Johnson & Johnson was ultimately lost a case of this nature. However, on appeal, that case was actually overturned. So while this reparations case was going on and they were using Johnson & Johnson as a argument for themselves, the case got overturned basically, and it kind of like messed up their argument in a big way. So ultimately, Tulsa County judge actually dismissed the reparations case over the summer, actually. The argument essentially that the city of Tulsa had made was that the case was overbroad. Like, the courts could not sort of be the people to reckon with the race massacre and redlining and urban renewal. The argument was that ultimately it was a political question, the things that Greenwood was seeking, and that therefore the courts were not the people to address it. And ultimately, the judge agreed with that argument. And in her decision, she said that the issues at play in this case were better solved by the legislative or executive branches. I should say at this point, though, that, in my book, I actually follow the legislative branch too. And so in my book, you'll follow Representative Regina Goodwin, who represents the Greenwood District, trying to get reparations through the legislature, and that's going nowhere. You know what I mean? And so in some ways, there's often a sleight of hand going on, I think, in justice in Oklahoma and in Tulsa, where every entity is saying there's a better place to go to try to seek redress, but no one actually wants to actually sit down and offer that level of redress to these massacre survivors and their descendants. And so right now, the case has actually been appealed to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. So, who knows, it might end up like Johnson & Johnson and get reversed. We don't know. But definitely it is a challenging case at the moment. And another, I think, at least moral setback I would say is that, so when this case started in 2020, there were 3 living survivors of the race massacre. Viola Fletcher is currently 109. Miss Leslie Benefit Randa, who just turned 109 on Saturday, actually. People here in Tulsa were celebrating her birthday with her in a big way. And we had a 3rd living survivor, Hughes Van Ellis, 102, but he actually just passed away in October, actually. And there's a ceremony here in Tulsa remembering him just last Friday. And so the way the public nuisance case is currently set up, the judge already dismissed all descendants from the case or churches in Tulsa from the case, etc. So you can only be on the case, a plaintiff on the case, if you actually are a survivor of the race massacre. And so when those last 2 survivors pass away, this case will be over. And some people here say that there's some sense that maybe the city's kind of waiting out the clock on them in a lot of ways. But when I talk to folks here about the issue, people like Regina Goodwin, who's featured prominently in the book, they say that this issue won't die with the survivors. It won't die with the current leaders. Like, until justice is served in some way, this is always going to be an issue in Tulsa, and it's always going to be shaping what this community is. Not only how people view the community, but also how people themselves here understand the place that they live. And so I think even if this case fails, you're going to still be seeing a lot of different avenues for justice being pursued by massacre survivors, by their descendants, and by other people who think that what happened here deserves to be remembered and deserves to be atoned for in some kind of way.
Victor, real quick, in your outline of the case here and all the issues that they're bringing up, could you urban renewal is kind of a euphemism to my mind. Could you explain what that means in real terms to this community?
Sure, happy to. So Greenwood was destroyed in 1921 and famously rebuilt. It's actually kind of amazing the extent to which the neighborhood was rebuilt afterwards. And so Greenwood actually had a second heyday in the 30s, 40s, and 50s of even more businesses being open, even more cultural vibrancy than before the race massacre. However, by the 60s and 70s, the neighborhood was going into decline. That was spurred by disinvestment from the white community. It was spurred in part by desegregation. So a lot of Black people could choose to leave if they wanted to. And so as this is going on, this idea of like urban renewal is sort of emerges as a federal initiative. And sort of the tagline or the selling point is the idea that urban renewal is going to be a way to bring in federal dollars to low-income communities and help them rebuild in a better vision of themselves. However, James Baldwin famously said that instead of being called urban renewal, it should have been called Negro removal, because in practice, urban renewal was an opportunity to use federal dollars to essentially push Black people out. You could buy out their properties from them. If they did not want to sell, often Black families were forced into selling through eminent domain policies, where a court can decide that for the public good, we're going to seize this property, force a property owner to take the payout, and they have to get out of here no matter what. And so in Greenwood's case, urban renewal actually came through a program called Model Cities. That was it was a facet of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. And so in this Model Cities program, they basically had these like 5-year initiatives in different cities to rapidly transform inner city neighborhoods. And so in Greenwood's case, there were more than 300 businesses in Greenwood circa 1970 when Model Cities began. And all those businesses got wiped out because everybody got bought out of the neighborhood to move or forced to move through eminent domain. And so I want to talk about a woman named Mabel Little, who was a part of urban renewal. Mabel Little survived the race massacre in 1921. She lived in Greenwood for 50 years. She had a house on Greenwood Avenue, actually. And she was somebody who was going to these planning meetings for urban renewal, voicing her opinion about things, had a lot of anxiety about what was going to happen. And ultimately, she was forced to sell too, like so many others. And in one of these planning meetings for urban renewal, she actually said that I was here in 1921, and what you're doing to us now is worse than that. And so I think that sort of captures, from the Greenwood perspective, how destructive that era was. And I believe that's actually the end of my presentation. So that kind of gets us through the present day, where Tulsa is right now. The last issue at play actually was there was at the Oklahoma Supreme Court, there was a protest just this past week at which the oldest living survivor was present with the attorneys for the case. And so, the legal battles are still ongoing, and we don't know where things are going to go. But like I said, I'm sure there will be other maneuvers in the future, whether this one succeeds or not. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer anyone's questions.
Thank you so much. You really know your stuff. You were able to just rattle all that off. Obviously, after writing and researching and writing this giant book, you're well versed in all the facts. And I have told everyone they can enter their questions in the chat. So people may be doing that, but I will kick us off with a question so people have a moment to formulate theirs. I noticed as I was reading through the book, you did seem to have this sensitivity to the position of and the experience of Black women, right? And you focused on Lula throughout this presentation, but there were other women as well. And even when you were talking about Black civil rights movements at that time, so you had like the Negro Business League and you had the NAACP and all that, and how they really were focused on, yes, they were focused on elevating Black people as a whole, but it was kind of through a male lens. And it was rare that women were thought about, talked about, or highlighted. And so I was just curious about, is there anything in your particular experience that made you sensitive to that issue of intersectionality, the plight of being a Black person at this time, but then also being a woman at this time? What is it about your experience that made you even aware of that or sensitive to that?
That's a great question. It's never been framed that way, so thank you for asking that question. Honestly, I think maybe part of it is like I'm from Alabama, so I'm from the Deep South and from sort of a patriarchal society. And so I think even going back to being a kid and observing, like when I would go to my dad's family's house down home, and just seeing the way that, like, for example, my dad's the oldest of 10, but like he's the oldest, but his sister, who's just younger than him, is sort of responsible for caring for the entire family. And so I feel like I just sort of observed even from a very young age the way that women in my family were sort of being in some ways forced into these very specific roles, whereas the men sort of had an opportunity to sort of like define their own roles for themselves. And so I think that's something I've always been attuned to from a young age. I think in terms of how it came to sort of play so prominently in this book, a lot of it was guided by the record, Like I said, I was actually surprised to find that all these women were on the property documents that I was finding. I was surprised to find Lula's affidavit declaring that she owned the Dreamland, and John could sit in the corner over there. And so I think I was already sort of maybe equipped to write about it this way, but I did it this way because the record sort of indicated that. And then I think once I had done it for the early section, when you fast forward to modern Greenwood, if you look at who the true leaders of this community, it is women like Regina Goodwin, who's the legislator here, and Tiffany Crutcher, who's a police reform activist and by far the most influential activist in Tulsa. And so I think I was ready to write it in that framing, but also it's certainly, I think, defined by the women who are actually achieving all these amazing things here in Tulsa, both in the past and present.
Well, I appreciate that you were, faithful to truth telling in that it was, I don't know, it was moving and inspiring and at times very heartbreaking, of course, to see what they went through. I'm still not seeing questions. Oh, wait. I see something coming up. Okay, thanks, Victor. I really love the book. You truly brought these historical individuals to life and gave face to such a horrific tragedy. It also seems like you have a good pulse on the current litigation. Obviously, nothing can replace the lives, property, pain, time, etc., that these folks experience. But I am curious what the current litigants, including survivors, are hoping to achieve through litigation. Obviously, financial compensation would be great, but I would imagine everyone also wants other less tangible recovery, such as recognition of fault, etc.
Sure, thank you for the question.
And that was from Drew Sarangoulis. Thank you, Drew.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Drew. So one thing, I guess one quirk of this public nuisance approach is that the survivors will not be getting like direct compensation. I think because they already tried that approach earlier and were dismissed, they had to find a different route in. And so the public nuisance case, basically the courts would be creating some sort of abatement to improve the society of Greenwood in some kind of way. And so the lawsuit has provided a lot of recommendations for what could be done, including building a hospital in Greenwood. The hospital closed there in 1960, so there's no hospital in the neighborhood or in North Tulsa, which is the wider swath of Black Tulsa. Another proposal has been foregoing tax payments for people in North Tulsa for 100 years to kind of like follow up on the 100 years of disenfranchisement they've gone through over the last century. And another dynamic I think is important to point out, I mentioned Watchmen earlier and this idea about like appropriation. And so there's an idea there. One of the proposals in the lawsuit is that a fund would be set up for massacre victims that would basically funnel money from the tourism stuff going on in Tulsa. There's a new museum for Greenwood, for example, and things like that. Some of the portion of that money would be funneled towards massacre survivors and descendants because their story is being profited off of in various ways. In terms of like recognition, that can be kind of tricky, actually, I think sometimes for people pursuing justice, because sometimes it almost becomes like a pressure release valve, you know what I mean? And so, for example, the City Council of Tulsa last year apologized for the race massacre kind of in a vague way. They didn't take too much ownership of it because there's legal implications of that. But they sort of said, like, we're sorry this happened to you, is kind of the energy of it. And so now they can kind of say, well, we gave you the apology, so what more do you want, And so I think there can be some challenges. Talking to some of the people involved in the legal fight, they often are a little bit wary of the apology avenue because it can kind of be leveraged to avoid more direct paths towards justice.
Wow. So even the apology is preventing justice. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I've learned a lot about those kind of dynamics here because, for example, this new museum was built in Tulsa called Greenwood Rising, and it had a lot of corporate donors and sponsors. More than $30 million actually were raised to build this museum. The city of Tulsa endorsed it. It actually got funding from the state of Oklahoma. And that was being built and opened in 2021 when the entire country was paying attention to Tulsa. And so, the idea to me is that, okay, something had to be done in 2021 because we knew the world would be looking at Tulsa. And like the thing that was done was building this museum. And now there's less political pressure because the world has moved on. And so when you really dig into a place like this, you realize that sometimes the things that seem good have like a ulterior motive or just a different dynamic that's playing out sort of under the surface. In the book, I try to expose some of those less discussed dynamics with the modern commemoration of the race massacre.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing and then I'll move on to the next question. But it does seem like this would be one time when reparations or some kind of, gesture would actually work, because there are living survivors, right? We know who they are. We know who their descendants are. So it's not like in other cases where, you say, well, how could you possibly figure out who did what to whom? We don't know, but it's like it's actually traceable. And so it would be easier in this instance to offer some kind of tangible repair for what you can't fully repair it, but something. And so it is a bit surprising that that has not happened to date. Okay, so our next question comes from Charla. Did you experience, this is for you, Victor, did you experience any secondary trauma while gathering facts to write this book? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Thank you for the question, Charla. So I'm pretty bad at processing things, I guess I would say. So for me at least, I think I absorbed a lot of trauma for a long time without really processing it. I actually remember that in my research, I came across this recording of the 50th anniversary of the Race Massacre. So in 1971 at Mount Zion Baptist Church, which was destroyed in the Race Massacre and rebuilt, there was a ceremony commemorating the Race Massacre. It was really the first kind of public commemoration of the event ever. And I have a recording of it through a library. So you hear all the speakers talking about what happened, survivors, including W.D. Williams, actually, Lula's son, spoke. And in the midst of all this, this Greenwood choir performed Lift Every Voice and Sing. And I think I often get really moved when I think about historical events that kind of place me there. So I was just thinking about, like, I was here in 2021, listening to this Black choir performing in 1971 about this anguish from 1921. And when I sort of felt that connection, it actually overwhelmed me. And I remember I just like wept listening to that music during this one day in my house, listening to doing the research. And so for me, like, I think my process would come out through things like that, through surprising discoveries like that. The only other way I really processed things was when I was writing about the Race Massacre itself. So I mostly write everything that I type everything. I'm on the computer all the time, like, all of us. But when I wrote the chapters about the Race Massacre, I actually wrote them by hand, which I almost never do. And I actually wrote them on Standpipe Hill. Standpipe Hill is a hill in Greenwood that overlooks the whole neighborhood. And it's actually where the National Guard placed a machine gun that shot down into the neighborhood in 1921. And so sitting up there and being able to sort of imagine, what Ed Goodwin would have seen as a kid when he moved to the neighborhood, but also what was destroyed in 1921. It really helped me kind of, like, I think, channel the spirit of that community in a more direct way. And so I think writing that out by hand in my notebook actually helped me process what was going on in some ways.
Yeah, and I said this in the intro, but there was a profound humanizing effect to your writing in this book. So prior to this, the only other time I'd read about a similar instance, call it a pogrom, if you will, specifically towards African Americans, was Toni Morrison's home. And of course, that's a fictional account, but it's based on a real story. And so that kind of drew me in. But this was your book, Built from the Fire, I think was so human. I had this image of the children hiding under their bed as men came into their home and set fire to the curtains and, rifled through their drawers for valuables and, set the home ablaze. And they're just trying so hard not to be discovered, things like that. And so I commend you for going to the site and delving into the record in the way that you did, because again, it just had such a humanizing impact rather than just reading about X number of people died or X number of dollars were lost. Bringing it down to that individual experience, I think, is very powerful. So thank you for doing that. We have another question. Earlier, you mentioned that there is current litigation happening. Is there anything else happening regarding justice for the victims of the massacre?
Yeah, so actually, last month I testified before the Oklahoma state legislature about the National Guard's involvement in the race massacre. And I was testifying along with probably half a dozen other folks from the community, including the two eldest survivors. They were actually there in their wheelchairs at the hearing. And so Representative Regina Goodwin, who again represents the district, she's going to be putting forward reparations legislation in the legislature this coming year. And so, she put forth some stuff last year, none of it passed. And it'll be a challenge to get it passed in a place like Oklahoma and this year. But she is putting it forward, and the chair of this committee who testified before seemed kind of more amenable to it than he had indicated before. So that's probably the most direct action that's happening. And then we talked about urban renewal a little bit earlier. So a highway was put through the middle of Greenwood in 1967. Like many other Black neighborhoods around the country, it was really destroyed, decimated by this interstate. But the federal government, the Department of Transportation, actually has provided about $1 billion for reconnecting communities, is the name of the program. And so they're actually purposefully providing funding to remove interstate highways from inner city communities that were devastated in the 1960s. And Greenwood actually got a grant for studying the idea from the federal government last year. And so right now, this sort of studies happening that may lead to the removal of the highway. And so that's a very big, it's a big deal here because I think when you see those highways, they feel so permanent, but Regina likes to say, if you can build it, you can take it down. And so that's in the air in Greenwood right now too.
Thank you. I don't currently see any more questions in the chat, but so I wrote down some questions. Let's see if I can figure out how to ask this one. I think your book, whether you purposely set out to do it or not, it really highlights the way that structural racism works. We saw how, federal law, state law, local government officials all had an impact on this community. And this is before even the massacre. You said that at one point they didn't have sewer, like they didn't have sewage service, right? Like the Black neighborhood was not given running water. I want to make sure I'm saying that right. But there were just basic public services that the community wasn't providing. And then of course, there were segregated public spaces, and the Black areas were always neglected and not cleaned properly and all that. And so it just made me wonder about how structural racism can ultimately contribute to how the majority would view Black people as a race, right? Because if they're always in these filthy conditions and sort of dilapidated areas, just, I can imagine being a child growing up and you just see, okay, that neighborhood looks this way and this neighborhood looks that way. That structural racism would contribute to how a whole race of people were viewed, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was just wondering if you thought about that, if that theme came up for you as you were writing the book, if there are other examples that you can think of to highlight that theme.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely a big dynamic at play. And I kind of see it almost in two different eras unfolding in the book and in America. And so, there's a chapter early in the book about the creation of Oklahoma as a state and how they imported Jim Crow to Oklahoma from the Deep South when it could have had a lot of other racial dynamics than a caste system. And we think about the idea that Oklahoma established at its founding that Black people were lesser. I think that political decision and the rhetoric associated with it opens the door for violence. So when you're sort of dehumanizing Black people on that level, on a political level, through the press, on all these dynamics, it just creates a opening for the vicious violence that we saw in the race massacre. So I think that's an example of structural racism leading to violence quite directly, actually. Mm-hmm. When you fast forward to later decades, I really agree with your point about how sometimes if you're not aware of the structural issues that have affected a place in the past, you can blame the people in the present for why it looks the way it does. And so to me, the most vivid example of that is before I moved to Tulsa, I would come and visit a lot for my reporting, and I took a lot of Ubers around and stuff like that. And almost everybody I took at Uber with said, don't move to North Tulsa, which is Black Tulsa. Like Greenwood is a part of a larger Black community called North Tulsa. And so everybody told me, don't move to North Tulsa. And then I went up there driving around sometimes, and I saw that a lot of it was like really empty, and some of it looks kind of desolate. And that's just like the vibe of some parts of that area of Tulsa. And in my mind, I kind of assumed that it had been sort of Black only for a long time, because that's just sort of the rhetoric around it. So this is a Black space. However, in my research, and it's discussed in the book, that North Tulsa, outside of Greenwood was actually predominantly white for a very long time. And when integration happened, white Tulsa abandoned this part of the city en masse. They took their resources, they took their customer base, they took their property tax revenue, and just left the neighborhood. You know what I mean? There's several neighborhoods. And so that level of disinvestment is one reason that North Tulsa has the issues it does today. And that's not really part of the current narrative around North Tulsa. It's just, this like rundown Black area, And so I do think that when you learn the history of a place, it makes it easier to understand why the architecture is the way it is today. I think that's really important before you judge the people who are in the space right now.
Which is why the telling of history is so very important, and why efforts to suppress real history are so very dangerous. I do want to say this. In reading the book, I was struck by social norms at the time and the meanness of that caste system, right? It was just so mean and weird, like it was okay for Black residents to be there as long as they were servants, but they couldn't be on, it was just very weird. And so I did reflect that we have come a long way. And I do think we should appreciate that progress, because you just typically don't see that level of meanness and hierarchy that existed at that time. And thank goodness we don't. That being said, with the rhetoric that has been growing in prominence in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years in this country, do you, as a historian, have any concerns of us returning to some semblance of that hierarchy or just that animosity that was once very common in the United States?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a risk. I think one revelation I've had, I think it was a mix of doing this research as I was maybe getting a fuller political awareness. I was a freshman in college when Barack Obama got elected for the first time, and so that really shaped my political awakening in a lot of ways, in terms of the idea that maybe America is a place of linear progress. Maybe we were at one place, we can kind of get better over time. And the Obama era sort of, in some ways, maybe made that seem plausible. But sort of as I sort of seen what's happened the last several years with increasing division in the country, with a lot of racial animosity, sometimes driven from the White House. I think that when I was learning about all of those, seeing all those dynamics in the present, and then realizing that, America actually had progress and huge contractions in the past, the Race Massacre is probably one of the most best examples of that, right? Greenwood was a place of huge Black success, independence, and autonomy, and was burned to the ground. And it wasn't just Greenwood. There were riots and massacres in more than 50 cities across the United States in that era. And so sort of now I've come to the conclusion that America is much more cyclical than I realized. We're kind of a country that has progress and then has contractions. We have a lot of political oscillation in this country. And so for me, at least, when I sort of understood that, it, to your point, made the learning of history more important. And also, I think, like, community engagement more important. Like, if the country's going to sort of almost be destined to have these sort of cycles, it becomes much more urgent, I think, to protect yourself and your community when the sort of inevitable backlash comes. So I'm more on the side of, to me, that's not necessarily pessimistic to me. Some people might say it is, but to me, it's just more about being aware of your responsibilities as a citizen. And so I think I take that responsibility more seriously now that I feel like I have a better understanding of how this country really operates.
Thank you. Did you have any closing comments or anything else that you wanted to say before we log off?
No, just thank everybody for taking the time really to just dig into the book. I know it's a big book, and so I appreciate anybody who took the time to dig into it. And I hope that it opens your eyes not only to what's happened in Greenwood, but what's happened in your own communities. Because everything that played out in this story happening in Tulsa played out in cities across America.
Absolutely. Victor Luckerson, thank you for your work. Thank you for all the speaking engagements you're doing, with the press or otherwise. Thank you to everyone who joined. Oh, and by the way, I do want to add that if I can find it, Victor was kind enough to autograph all of our books. And so we really appreciate that. We appreciate you spending time with us today. It is great that we're still in a time when we can learn about this stuff, right? And I hope that we continue to be able to learn the truth of the country's history, its progress, its pitfalls, all of that. So thanks again, Victor. Thank you to everyone that joined. Have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank y'all so much. Thank you.